in Isaiah chapter 53. In Isaiah chapter 53. You know, the Bible also says that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, and he was. The Bible also said that he would leave out of Egypt. He would come out of Egypt, and Jesus did. Mary and Joseph fled with Jesus to Egypt, and then later he came out to start his ministry back around Galilee, in Nazareth, and Jerusalem, in Israel. So he fulfilled many, many prophecies. But look at chapter 53. This entire chapter is talking about the Messiah. And he says this in verse 3. He said, the Messiah is despised and rejected of men. He's a man of sorrows. He's acquainted with grief. We hid as if we were ashamed and esteemed him not. Surely he bore our griefs, and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken and smitten of God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities. And the chastisement of our peace was on him. And his stripes, by his stripes, we are healed. It goes on to describe him even more. It says in verse 10, it pleased the Lord to bruise him. But then he says he will give him the kingdom to rule and reign forever. This is a description of what Jesus went through. He was bruised, he was beaten, he was crucified. The Messiah, you see, was to be the sacrifice. People in the days of Jesus, many of them rejected Jesus because he was not an earthly king that would free them from the oppression of the Romans. They were wanting a king to rise to power that would set them free from Roman slavery. But that was never God's plan. Chapter 53 tells us what God's plan was all along. That his Messiah, God's anointed one, God's Redeemer, God's Son would come and actually be the sacrifice. He would take the beating, take the bruises, remember they did so many things. They pulled his beard out. They beat the crown of thorns down into his skull. They slapped him and said, who's hitting you? They made fun of him and mocked him and spit on him. It's all described here in chapter 53. How could anybody else have been the Messiah other than the one who went through all this? And his name is Jesus Christ. There is no other way. We have a great song that we play on the gospel station, and it's called There Is No Other Way, and Jenny Engel sings it. We had a concert last night up around Henrietta, and she sang that song, and that song just gets me because it's so true. And so many people are allowing the world to compromise the very foundation of their faith. Folks, there is no other way. Jesus is the Messiah. He is the one and only. Back in Psalm chapter 22. I'm going to close with some things in Psalm 22. Now, there have been times I've taught the entire chapter. It's very good to read this entire chapter. But Psalm 22, if nothing else gets your attention, this ought to get your attention. I ought to write this down, underline these things that Jesus went through. Now, Isaiah was written about 700 years before Christ came onto the earth, before he was born. But Psalms even older than that. You know, they're written somewhere a stretch between 1,400 years and 1,000 years or so before Christ. Somewhere in that time period was when these things were written. And even then, God was promising that he was going to send his Son. He was going to send the Anointed One. What's the oldest book in the Bible? Job. And even the book of Job said, I know that my Redeemer liveth, and on the earth again he shall stand. You see, every book of the Bible promised the one that God would send. The one that God would send. And in Psalm 22, What did Jesus cry out on the cross? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Is what Jesus cried out on the cross. In verse 1, in Psalm 22, he was quoting this psalm when he cried out on the cross. This psalm was written 1,000 years before he hung on the cross. Jesus was quoting this scripture. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? And so if you turn to Psalm 22, you find a full and complete description of the brutality that Jesus went through on the cross. Some might say, well, Jesus set himself up to become the Messiah, or Jesus fulfilled these prophecies on purpose. Well, we know that that's not true, but to the skeptics and the scoffers out there who want to use that as an argument, Jesus Christ could not have set himself up to go through the things he went through that are depicted in Psalm 22. Jesus Christ could not have set up a scheme to have the crucifixion and all the brutality of it happen to his own body. Yet it was recorded 1,000 years before it happened in these scriptures. And it says in chapter 22, verse 6, he says he was despised of the people. Well, that's true. How sad that is. He did nothing but good. He went around healing the sick, raising the dead, giving eyes to the blind and ears to the deaf. Yet he was despised by many, many people. If you do good in this world, if you love people and if you care about people, you're going to be despised by many, many people. That's just the way it is and always will be. Verse 7 says, they will mock me and ridicule me. It says they'll shoot out their lip and shake their head. They'll laugh at me, it says in verse 7. Now in verse 9, this is where he is declaring that God sent Jesus to the womb of Mary. He said, you are he, talking about God, that took me out of the womb and made me hope. Even while I was still nursing my mother, I was the hope of the world. In verse 10, he said, I cast down upon thee from the womb, thou art my God. He's saying, even while I was still in my mother's womb, I knew that you were my God and you were my Father. I had a purpose before I was even born. Look in verse 14. What happened when they thrust the spear into the side of Jesus? What happened to it? The water gushed out. And in verse 14 he says, I am poured out like water. He says also, all my bones are out of joint. And that happened to Christ. My heart has become like wax. And that's what happens in a crucifixion. The heart just kind of melts. It just dissolves. I mean, basically, a person's heart struggles so hard to breathe in crucifixion that it enlarges and almost liquefies. It is like congestive heart failure, just sped up 100 times faster. It's a horrible way to die. It says in verse 15, my tongue cleaves to my jaws. And what did Jesus say on the cross? I thirst. In verse 16 it says, dogs or people that are no good have surrounded me. An assembly of the wicked have closed around me. And then this, they have pierced my hands and my feet. 1,000 years before it happened, it was depicted. And then verse 18, they took my garments and they cast lots for them upon my vesture. How could Jesus be anyone but this Messiah? He is the Messiah. He is the only way to God. He's the only one who can forgive your sin. He's the only one that loved you enough to go through that.